The Software Leaders Uncensored podcast, where tech leaders grow beyond the code.
You're listening to Software Leaders Uncensored, where software leadership gets real, uncut, and unfiltered. I'm your host, Steve Taplin. I've started over 30 companies. 20 of those didn't make it. 10 became real wins. And every single one I built has always been built around custom software and creating that unique experience. Today, I work with other tech leaders to build high-performing engineering teams through my company, Sonatify. We are a nearshore software development firm. On this podcast, I sit down with the sharpest minds in software, CTO, founders, architects, and operators to talk about what's working, what's broke, how to build, and exactly what matters. No fluff, no filters. Let's get into it. So I'm very lucky to have Conor Sibley as my guest today. Conor has an impressive resume, not only as a CTO and as a tech lead, but as a venture partner, as board of directors, as advisor to companies, as lecturers. Conor is the CTO at Higher Logic, where he was the CTO for 11 years, left, and then came back. And so I'm excited to dive in here. Conor, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Steve. Glad to be here.
Walk us through your journey of your career of being the CTO for 11 years at your company and coming back. Walk us through.
God. So going back to the very beginning, I grew up in the DC area, got involved in the dot-com boom way back in the day, experienced the boom bust cycle of the internet. That got me just obsessed with startups, but it also ended up teaching me that it's very dangerous to be involved in early stage businesses. And so after that boom bust
Keeps you on your toes, doesn't it?
Yeah. There's a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking that you can end up doing about oh my God, if only we had done this thing back then. But so I did that, startup work prior to going to undergrad. And so then I ended up going to undergrad, finished off undergrad, and my dad said to me, don't do this startup stuff anymore. So I went to the biggest and most opposite of the tech world. I went to DARPA and ARDA. I went to BBN Technologies, and I got to work with people that put the @ in email and did all sorts of crazy stuff. And so I did Intel work up until I got bored with or not bored. You never get bored of doing it, but it kind of scares you when you end up working on things that you can't ever tell anybody about. And so then,
yeah, that's no fun.
I mean, it was interesting, but if you ended up talking about it, you go to jail for a long time. It's a bummer. So then after I decided I wanted a career switch, I did the thing that I'd done in the past, which is I went back to school and got the old MBA. And then after getting an MBA, I did the opposite of what everybody in business school was doing at the time. Instead of going into consulting, I went into startups. And everyone looked at me like I was crazy.
I'm seeing a theme with you here, Conor. Loving the startup world. It's addicting.
Yeah, it was really addicting. What was not addicting was having to talk to my girlfriend, who's, now my wife at the time, and have those conversations about, well, I know I've got these massive student loans that I have to pay, but I think I'm going to do another startup where I don't get paid for them.
And you're still married today, right? So
yeah.
I guess it worked out.
Yeah. But so after a number of fits and starts through, startups, and I found the team at Higher Logic, came on board, helped them, grow and scale that business for, like you said, 11 years, brought on board a capital partner about six or 7 years in, a JMI. They were absolutely awesome. So we went from growing like this to all of a sudden, acquiring a ton of different businesses very quickly. We actually acquired 2 businesses that were competitive in a vertical and closed on them in the same day. There's all sorts of crazy stuff that I could end up talking about that.
In your first stint at Higher Logic, how'd you work your way up to CTO? I mean, that's the coveted title for every, engineering leader.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing was a lot of the founding team was highly technical. The CEO was the person who architected and, wrote most of the code at the time, Rob. And so coming in, I didn't think that he wanted to give me the title, right? So I came in as a director of engineering. And, after a little bit, he was like, maybe he's not so stupid. I had a relationship with one of the other co-founders who was the head of sales at the time. And so I was a super early staff member. I mean, I was one of the first actually, salaried employees there.
Okay.
So that was, that was a lot of the reason.
this was before private equity came in and gave it the big growth.
Yeah. I mean, the nice thing was it was a pretty atypical, self-funded, right? The first money in was private equity. And so that was the thing that I found very interesting because I've been a part of a number of different startups in the past, and I saw what throwing money on the fire did. It just created a lot of smoke, and it made it so that
Yes.
it was very hard to see what was important. One of the nice things about organic growth is that it forces you to focus on what's important. And, it just really forces you to focus on the customers, right? So forces you to focus on growth and retention. And a lot of times you lose sight of that when you get a lot of money that gets thrown at marketing and product initiatives that may or may not pay off. You just get distracted, you lose sight of the ball, and then everything goes out the window. So there's some really interesting things about the journey that I had, and they probably don't end up translating to people based upon what their experience is, right? Like, if you're told to grow a team incredibly quickly based upon if you're told to grow a team very quickly to build a set of features that you don't know whether or not the market wants or needs them, I'm not your guy.
That's throwing a lot of good money at what could be bad, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, we could talk at length about a lot of stuff related to, that what I've seen, people screw up, because of capital structures and stuff. But,
So you've been this startup junkie since pre-college, after college. You had a great initial run working your way up to CTO at Higher Logic. Why'd you leave and then come back?
so God, the team at Higher Logic, I think they thought it was really funny that I was around for more than probably 2 years, right? Because prior to Higher Logic, I'd always had maybe 9 months to 2 years before I got bored and then jumped.
Okay.
And what kept me around at Higher Logic was that I was learning so much so quickly, and I'd never experienced the kind of change that I experienced while we were going through those growth curves. So the first it was a product adoption. Right. And after we experienced a ton of product adoption, because this was a B2B2C company, I haven't really said much about what Higher Logic does, but we run tens of thousands of websites, send billions of emails. I mean, there's all sorts of interesting things around scale that we had to deal with as we were moving up the product utilization curve. It was really early on in the cloud. And so, people thought we were crazy moving from data center into this thing called AWS.
Which the cloud basically just means somebody else's data center, but hey.
Yeah, exactly. And so moving workloads from, terrestrial data centers into the cloud when AWS only had 3 services. And now you have to have a PhD and a PhD in their blog to just figure out what the hell's going on
Exactly.
inside the world. And so that was kind of it was an interesting time to be coming up, right? And so I had to learn how to basically stay on top of a lot of things that were moving, and as while our customer base was moving and changing, while we were also changing, from a team and a structure perspective, going from to 15 people to 30 people to 50 people to 150 people to 350 people. All of those different points have very different ramifications, management style, structure style. I learned a lot about how technical architecture very frequently mimics organizational architecture. That's something that spent a lot of time trying to unravel with the companies that we've acquired. So, there was a ton of learnings, and over time, I was learning very, very, very quickly. And once I stopped learning as quickly and I was started to look around, and I went, oh my God, you know what? It's kind of like a child, right? I've been with my child through kindergarten, elementary school, junior high school. And now all of a sudden I was looking around and I was like, shit, my kid went to college and I'm that creepy dad that's down there on the weekend. And instead of letting the kid spread its wings and fly away, I'm sitting there holding it back. And so that was when I was like, you know what? And I hit the ejector seat and left.
Okay. So you felt complacency. You felt like you weren't learning. You felt like they kept you there longer than the 9 months to 2 years that they predicted.
Yeah.
What'd you go off and do during that time that you left?
So I was trying to figure out what I was going to do when I grew up. So during that journey, while Higher Logic was growing, I've always stayed pretty I've always stayed with my fingers pretty deeply inside of the DC ecosystem. So I'm from outside of Washington DC, and so I've been part of a group of entrepreneurs in the area that were doing basically like angel investments, and we would source deals and we would kick around like diligence documents for the deals that we were like investing in, and it only took a little bit before people started to realize I was highly technical and I could dig in and I could do product engineering, go to market. But there were other people that were better at different aspects of like, the diligence process. And so people would pull me in for certain portions of like, diligence on deals. And then we would like glom all together and then kick out like a diligence document, and lots of people started to be interested in the diligence documents that we were putting together. And not too long after, like we started having people come together, present and those like presentations that would be done in like a bar or restaurant. They were always really fun because you were getting to meet other local entrepreneurs, and having local entrepreneurs sitting down and helping that next phase of entrepreneurs that were coming through was always really awesome.
So you were approaching that as an angel investor then, it sounds like.
Yeah, but I was approaching it as an angel investor, but it helped me immeasurably because like one of the reasons why I always like to like stay around early stage businesses is because you're never going to learn more about something than from an expert who's trying things at the cutting edge, right? And you're never going to see anyone in life work harder than people at the like formulation stage of like a startup. And so people will be taking like concepts that may or may not work, and they're just going to do square peg round hole with technologies, with systems, with processes, with new markets, with new like new. And by sitting around and like watching like what people are doing and seeing how they're failing and seeing how they're being successful, you learn so much about what not to do. And so I always found that was like, incredibly beneficial for me, because when I would drop into a business, I would be like, common wisdom is, what you're saying doesn't work. And so I would give it like, benefit of the doubt, trust but verify. And so I would dig in, I'd look at what someone was doing, how they were doing it. And then I'd be like, well, shit, they're making it work, and they're making it work. And you would learn which technologies, which processes, which systems they were using. And I would take and I would be like, boop, boop. And I'd bring it into the organization that I was working at, Higher Logic at the time. And so I loved like digging in and doing diligence on businesses because that was something that just like taught me an immeasurable amount about like the world.
It's a great way to learn about different companies, about what they're doing, seeing just the disruptive nature of what startups do. And, I kind of take that back to my journey of 30 ventures, 20 losses, 10 wins. I wish you could have learned them a different way than 20 losses, but that's part of it. Trying different things, pushing the edge, trying disruptive stuff, changing industries. It's
Yeah,
fun though.
yeah. Well, I mean, and the industry thing is really interesting as well, because there's some things that may work in one vertical and just totally don't work in another, for a number of different reasons. For compliance, tool chain, whatever it is, whatever it is. And so, that's the other fascinating thing is like, you may think that, you've got the most amazing thing in the world. And then all of a sudden you end up taking that, you lift it and shift it into another vertical. And you're like, whoa, I suck, actually.
You have to adapt.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
let's fast forward, Connor. So you've had this opportunity to look at organizations inside and out. You're back at Higher Logic. You have a very large engineering team, over 75 people.
Mhm.
Tell me about some of the initiatives and projects you guys are doing.
Yeah, so the engineering and the support organizations report into me, and one of the reasons why I think that's important is when I was making the decision to come back, it was right around the time that AI had started to take hold, and I'm a proponent of like anything that you don't have control over, you have a very hard time changing, and I experienced that in droves actually. Towards the end of my tenure at Higher Logic, the first time was that like when you were a small business, as an owner of a small business, as an owner, founding team, that kind of stuff, you could go in and you could change anything because the teams were small and everybody was like very interested in change. The larger an organization gets and the longer that humans have been doing something, the harder it is to change it. And so sometimes the only way to change something is to have like, organization reporting control, right? And uh, I had a hypothesis that one of the places that AI was going to have the biggest impact was actually on like support, right? And so I was like, well, if I'm going to want to make sure that I have the ability to change it, like I want to make sure that that's something that's within my purview, as I come back in. And I what's been fascinating is like I've always been ambitious in my goals and I've always had like, crazy ass like, dreams and they're normally like, 10 to 20% right. I had no idea like, how right I was and how much I'd undershot. I mean, we could talk uh if it was something that that you found interesting about like some of the initiatives that we have underway and some of the implications of them. So it's something that we're focusing on right now on the engineering side of the house because we've started to see like a massive benefit has been uh, having like a common enterprise data plane. And
Okay.
that common enterprise data plane, I mean, it sounds kind of obvious when you start talking about it. There's all of these like, chunks of organizational, like, siloed information that any company that's been around for a long time has knowledge repositories sitting in everything from their email, Slack, Teams, internal documentation platforms, from Confluence to SharePoint to learning
It's kind of
management.
hard to train large language models on data that's not aggregated and consistent.
Exactly. And so that non-aggregated, non-consistent, locked away behind like logins makes that stuff useless. Right. And the longer that a company has been operating, the more likely it is that there's silos of data that people don't even know exists. What's been fascinating is as we've started to like build out like this organizational data plane and then make it so that it's accessible by some tools like I don't know if you're familiar with like there's open source tools like Onyx, and then there's like Glean, if you've heard of that.
Yes.
So we've had a incredible benefit, even though like some of these tools are really freaking expensive. We've seen a big benefit behind giving these tools to like especially any of the customer facing teams. Biggest reason is when we started doing like time inventory studies, right? We started to see that people in the organization were spending an inordinate amount of time in meetings, right? And when we looked at that, like a lot of times it was to do basically like information sharing. And so if you're thinking like long and hard about how much time you have that's being wasted in an organization versus when you're being productive, a majority of meetings are massive wastes of money.
I understand. And I agree.
And the bigger a business gets, the more likely it is that you're sitting in meetings doing information sharing. And so if you can figure out ways to, instead of having to sit in meetings, you can have information at people's fingertips as soon as like a new feature is released, right? You don't have to do release notes and then train people. Imagine if you could end up as software was being written, you could document that software and have not just like one kind of documentation, but you could have architectural documentation for onboarding senior engineering teammates into like this new product. You could have documentation that would be focused on support. You could have documentation that we focus on implementation of your product, and you can have documentation that we focused on uh, sales engineering, like, oriented activities. And imagine if all of that stuff could be like built, developed, and exposed in a branch while software was being written, so that the minute that a feature was released, all of that was accessible to not just your support organization, but your implementation team members and sales engineering.
And is this the goal, or have you fully implemented this? Because this is a pretty monstrous task, to say the least.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, we're doing some really interesting stuff. Like we've proved it out because we've got a ton of different products that we acquired over time. And what I'm in the process of doing is proving it out related to like, vertical slices of the product platform. And so the process that we're undertaking right now. So what we do is we're also trying to see how much of this we can just put on like a flywheel, so that there's a theory that we have that, like, the way that software is being written just fundamentally changed, right? And it's not just because of some of these tools where, you start writing a piece of software and it just completes the line. That's the way that I see a ton of engineers, like, using some of these tools. And I think that they're completely misunderstanding the utility of like some of these applications. And what's funny is I've seen the more senior the more senior an engineer is, the closer you are to like, a systems architect, the worse I see them using these because the way that they work, because of like, the mental model that like these people have of the way that they work has not changed. And so what I see like, systems architects doing is they've got a mental model of like the problem. And then what's like benefited them in the past is because they got the model of this problem, they then have a very specific way of like breaking things down so that they can like get a MVP out incredibly quickly that does this like one little thing in this one little way. And they open up an IDE like Windsurf or Cursor or one of these other tools, and they tell it to implement that one little thing at the edge. And they just tell it to do this like one little thing, and then it doesn't do it exactly the way that they wanted, and then it doesn't compile, and they're like, this thing sucks. And
So how have you overcome this? Taking these senior engineering professionals and having them adapt their productivity with the appropriate AI tools?
Well, what we're trying to do is we're trying to completely like retrain the way that people end up like approaching these problems, because that's why you would have like a senior systems architect. They'd come in, they would solve something, they go right to the problem, they go right to the edge, and they would just like know to change one little thing. But the world that we live in now is completely changed. What people should be doing is, instead of like, using these like models and these tools to write like code at the edge, they should be using the models to have deep conversations for like 20 to 30 minutes to build like massive amounts of context about the problem that you're trying to solve. And then once you end up having that like massive conversation about the product you're trying to solve, then you should add in the context of the documentation that you've created in the past, the architectural components, the use cases. And then you should end up like using those build tests. And once you've used those to build tests, now you've got the validation, you've got the business logic, the validation process, and then you can put that into a system that then can iterate until the tests pass. And at which point you've got a system that you've got documentation related to the tests. So you know that, how and why the system operates the way that it does. And you can put it into a CI/CD process and have it make changes, kick those things out, know that they're safe. Because that's one of the biggest problems I've run into with a lot of these, like, a lot of these tools, is that they'll go in and they'll start modifying files. And when they modify them, it may compile. Sometimes it actually doesn't even compile, but it'll just whole swaths of business logic. And so, you have to be very careful. And so this is one of the like, the arguments that a lot of these like, the systems architects will end up making. They're like, why? You see how stupid this thing is? It just removed this whole chunk of logic. I'm like, well, yeah, it was really stupid that it removed it. But it's even stupider that you didn't have something in place to validate that that didn't happen, because you didn't have like, strong test coverage. So this is like, one of those other things that's kind of interesting about like, just like moving backwards, right?
You're tackling all the engineering challenges out there to try to find a better way. I love it.
Yeah, well, I mean, what's kind of interesting is, as we started to adopt all these like, AI tools, we started to realize that like, these AI tools are no different than like a new staff member, where you have to, just like you have to onboard a new staff member, you have to onboard a tool, and you have to onboard a model. You have to teach it, right? And each one of these tools has got like, the nuances. Some of them, a staff member may be great at UI, maybe great at UX, might be great at documentation, might like that's the difference between all these models. And so you have to onboard them, you have to try them out. You won't just have like, one tool chain. We're using, I don't know if you've heard of like Devon. Yeah. So we're using Devon for some very specific use cases around like, monitoring. So our production telemetry. So we're basically, creating dashboards in there that show like classes of like production issues, isolate them to features, and then pull out the most like egregious one of those, and then put them into GitHub issues, have those things prioritized, and then have Devin just operating on a loop, popping the highest priority item out and fixing those not in the form of just like, fixing them, checking them in and having them fly out, but identify a fix, create documentation related to it, create testing related to it, put it into a PR branch, and then assign it to a team to review based upon what area of the platform the issue was identified within in Datadog. And so that's another one of those like, flywheels. And what's been fascinating is that we had areas of the platform that were just like, we'll sometimes see like, 300,000 exceptions in an hour off of like, some of our data integration pipelines. And it's just so overwhelming to go in there to identify like, problems. And so there was just massive noise inside of inside of the production environment. And because there was so much noise, there's no signal. No one was able to go in there and figure out what the hell was going on because people just get overwhelmed and then pop off and then be like,
So along those lines, Connor, so you have this large 75 plus person engineering team. What balance do you do of trying to implement new innovation with making sure you're not slowing down, getting features out and closing tickets? What's the balance?
well, we're in the process right now of trying to figure out like, what that new like organizational architecture ends up looking like. Because I can see what that system looks like. That, in the future, there's going to be for each of our product lines, there's going to be that evolutionary system that I just like, talked about. That you're not going to have like software engineers writing code, in a traditional fashion. You're just going to have like, a subject matter expert and a prompt engineer basically coming up with requirements and then feeding into the system. And then we're going to have what used to be, DevOps and IT, team members. We're going to have a lot of those people like, now focused on like, managing the system. And so we're going to have, massive changes, I think, in the way that we end up like, running SaaS companies, massive changes. So the engineers are going to have to learn how to give feedback about like why a model or giving feedback to models. So instead of like, the senior engineers mentoring junior engineers, you're gonna have the senior engineers mentoring the models and giving feedback and creating the documentation, the routing, the steering, the feedback to, create the context so that like better solutions get created quicker. And so we've got certain staff members they're getting reoriented and focused on that work. So building
Okay.
out systems and then doing the feedback process. And then we've got other team members that we're going to pull out. And this is the other thing that I've like started to find is that like, traditionally when we would like, acquire a company, there were things that we would never touch and we would never do. Even if we found something that was like, absolutely like from a technology perspective, we would always iterate on it. Right. Because it was just way too dangerous to build anew.
Right. You can't just throw it out and start over.
Yeah.
Well, not always.
Well, but I think that I am suffering from like PTSD from having tried to do that in the past and failed a number of times. And so just summarily throw out like anybody would be like, well, should we just build this thing anew? I think that now is like a brand new like, option. I think the path to doing that like, I think what we're probably going to do with some of the portions of our like, application infrastructure is we're going to go in and use LLMs to come up with all of the use cases. So basically just like go into an existing code base and then like create like a structure for, the architectural, the business use, like that kind of stuff. And then take it from old programming language to new. And I think that like if you set up the system that the new environment will run in and then you just feed in a set of requirements, I think that we're going to be able to get into a world not long from now where we're going to be able to single shot like brand new like infrastructure systems architectures. It's like world changed.
I love the vision. Yeah, everything you talk about is certainly cutting edge, taking the most advantage of tools out there. Connor, what advice would you have to other CTOs and engineering leaders out there who want to follow this similar path?
Biggest piece of advice is do it yourself, right? Like it's kind of like skiing, right? You can't read a book on skiing and then have any credibility with someone because you're not gonna understand what like skiing's like up until you get up on the mountain, you put on the skis, you strap them on, then you try and you fall on your face and you really hurt yourself and you think that you're like an expert and all of a sudden you get into moguls and you're like, what is this? That same experience is basically what you end up having when you start using some of these like, AI coding tools. So as an engineering leader, as a product leader, as like, any person inside of an organization, even like, non-technical people. I've been working with even some of our internal operations and finance team members. Are you familiar with Bolt.new?
I am not, no.
It's going to completely change the way that like, product management ends up working. I mean, it's basically like, except except just like sitting in a browser and you can single shot UXs. And we've had like, operations, finance, and, people that have never had any interest in doing anything related to software development, basically just like sit down and via requirements, have like a highly functional bespoke UX up and running in no time. And the reason why I think that that's going to completely change the way that product management works is, what's better than like than a functional spec? Nothing, right? What's even better than a functional spec is like, having something sent to you by somebody where they actually sat down and they created a UX which works. And what they're doing is they're saying to you then like, now take this and then put it into our system. That is going to make everything run and operate like astronomically faster. And the other thing that I think is like, kind of interesting is like, taking these tools and spreading them throughout the organization. As you do that, you start to cause people to be like, oh my God, the world has changed. Like, do I need Salesforce anymore? If like I have an organizational data plane and I can, using the model, just tell it what information I need to get in the format that I need to get it. Like, I mean, there's
You have a great vision on it, and I have to laugh because I think Salesforce is the best marketing company in the world, except everybody who has Salesforce hates it. But yet they keep buying it. And I definitely agree with you. The power of getting working prototypes in front of people sooner than later is the way to get buy-in. We are running out of time here, Conor. Thank you for getting uncensored with us today. You're an exciting guy. You have a great vision of cutting edge. Any final shout outs or advice for tech leaders navigating change, that words of wisdom you'd like to give?
AI or die.
AI or die. I love it. I love it. Conor, thank you so much. That's it for this episode of Software Leaders Uncensored. I'm Steve Taplin, guy who's built 30 companies, failed at 20, won with 10. Every single one of them powered by custom software. If you like what you've heard, subscribe, share it. Remember, the builders win. Everyone else is just posting. Thanks, everybody.